No doubt you've heard, dear viewer, about the controversy sparked by Netflix's show on the famous last pharaoh, Cleopatra. The decision to have the final pharaoh, of a Macedonian Greek ruling family, portrayed by a black actress, a decision they openly admitted was for political reasons, incensed many historians and garnered significant outcries from Egyptians. So much so that back in April, an Egyptian lawyer went so far as to file a case with the public prosecutor to have Netflix shut down in the North African state. But enough people have already talked about all the outside drama. Instead, let's answer this question. Ignoring all the outside media and controversy, is Queen Cleopatra worth giving a watch? The 4-part series presents itself as a docudrama, which means it should be a fact-based representation of actual events. Of course, that doesn't mean it will be entirely 100% accurate, but it does mean that at least it shouldn't contradict known facts. So let's kick back, relax, and break this episode down, solely judging it for the contents of the show itself and the records of history. We open to the dulcet tones of Jada Pinkett Smith, telling us that there was a time when women ruled with unparalleled power, as warrior queens, mothers of nations, bowing to no man with legacies that stand unapologetically through time. We hear Cleopatra left footprints so deep that no man could ever erase them. That's the teaser. That's the intro. That's the hook to get you to give the show a chance. We get our title screen, and it's time to dive into the events of Cleopatra's life. However, the first thing we get after the title is Professor Shelley Haley, telling us that when she was a little girl, her grandmother told her, "I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black." Why is this the first thing we're told when the documentary starts? I don't know, because they just drop that line in and move on without elaborating further. We get the setting, Alexandria, Egypt, 51 BC. Cleopatra is already in her upper teens. We don't discuss theories of her childhood or her time with her father in exile. We see her studying in the Library of Alexandria. We're told she's first and foremost a scholar, a scientist, and a linguist. Scholar and linguist for sure. The woman spoke several languages, including Egyptian, which her predecessors did not bother with. I'm not sure what she did that constitutes being a scientist, but it does make her sound cooler. She's summoned to her father's chambers, where he's on his deathbed, surrounded by her siblings and the royal servants. Her father shoos away her weak, timid, and effeminate brother to make room for Cleopatra. Papa tells her not to trust anyone, and that others will tear down everything he's built, and that he sees himself in her. And he dies. Now here we get a decent little description from our experts on the court intrigue among the Ptolemaic siblings, historically prone to murdering each other. Albeit, it's to a backdrop of Cleopatra's brothers looking weak, needing to be coddled. At the same time, Cleopatra tearfully announces that her father has died. Her sister, Arsinoe, gives her the jealous look that tells us she's going to be a problem later. She tells the room they'll be doing things differently from now on, and then walks out, hand in hand with her 2 female servants, Charmian and Iris. Professor Shelley tells us that those 2 are under-recognized female advisors of Cleopatra, which may be true because in my research I could only find a couple of sentences about Charmian and pretty much nothing about the other one. Some comments about this scene. Perhaps because the show has drawn attention to it, I have to note that the entire royal family is darker skinned, but we'll be back for that later. We don't know much about Ptolemy, not to be confused with Ptolemy or Ptolemy. By way of personality, we know he's 11, we know he's under the influence of the powerful eunuch Pothinus, who will act as the boy's regent. However, the show chooses to portray him as weak, even showing Ptolemy, not to be confused with Ptolemy, saying to him, "Enough with the sniveling." A far cry from the "when I look at you, I see me," he says to his robust, brave, legacy-securing 18-year-old daughter. Cleopatra may well have been her father's favorite, and we can recognize that, but we can't ignore the fact that he named her co-ruler with her brother. Yes, there's a tradition of sibling marriage and co-rule, but as you might have noticed, there's another brother too. There's nothing to support Ptolemy, this one, being a timid and whimpering little boy, except for a comment later made by Julius Caesar himself, which must be taken with a grain of salt, because they were at war with each other at the time, and unlikely to say very positive things of each other. Also, notice the way that prominent women are shown in this scene. Cleopatra stands up to the scheming Pothinus. Arsinoe doesn't shed a tear. Charmian and Iris walk out hand in hand with Cleopatra, united and supportive. Where the women are strong, while the men are weak or conniving. Why does this matter? Well, as with Ptolemy before, we know facts about these historical figures, but we don't know personalities, which means the expression of character traits shown are what the showmakers have chosen to depict. Obviously, they want to tell the story of a strong woman, and by all accounts, Cleopatra was intelligent, strong-willed, clever, and effective. But the scene tries to show you strong women, plural, in general, by showing you them contrasted with weak men, and that's lazy at best. The show continues, and Cleopatra is praised some more, and is shown wanting to make new traditions, which is silly because she very much wanted to steep herself in all the existing rituals and customs to ingratiate herself with the people. Patterns mentioned before continue, and in the following scene, we see the marriage of Cleopatra to her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy. I know it sounds weird, but this was a common practice at the time. Egyptian rulers did this. She crowns him in the ceremony, but for forced narrative reasons, he's too afraid and timid to crown her. So she crowns herself. Man weak, woman strong. So we get to the early part of her reign, totally leaving out the fact that she hid the reality of her father's death from the common people for months to solidify her power base, which I think is clever. I don't know why they don't mention it. Professor Shelley tells us that in general, the Ptolemies kept themselves separated from the Egyptian people, although apparently not that separated, given their complexions. Make up your mind. A trend that Cleopatra bucks by starting her reign traveling down deep into Upper Egypt to participate in a big religious festival of the common people, demonstrating she wants to be an Egyptian queen, not just a Greek one. She's learned the language, she practices the faith, she's one of them. But then, we veer off to talk about what really matters again, her race. Shelley tells us we don't know who her mother was. True, we don't know for sure, but we do have a decent guess. Or her grandmother. Again, true, we don't know for sure, but we have a decent guess. And without conclusive answers to those questions, history concedes it's theoretically possible Cleopatra was part Egyptian. So we're taking that possible and running with it, baby, and we really are running with it, because there is no historical evidence any of the Ptolemaic rulers ever took an Egyptian wife, and precisely one known Egyptian mistress to an earlier king from centuries earlier, who is specifically remembered because she wasn't Greek. There is nothing substantial here. It's headcanon. Her ancestry, of which she was proud, is Greek and Syrian, not Egyptian, and certainly not African black. We're told that Cleopatra represents herself as Egyptian, so it's very strange that we insist on depicting her as wholly European. A couple thoughts on that. She had coins minted in which she literally represented herself looking Greek. She adopted Egyptian habits and garb for ceremonies and images, yes, but she was raised using Greek education styles and contended with Rome as a Greek queen, not Egyptian. Even her name, Cleopatra Philopatris, lover of her father, references her Greek and Seleucid ancestry. And also, wholly European is an impressively vague line, because that encompasses all the ethnic appearances from Ireland to Spain, Scandinavia to Sicily, Russia to Bulgaria, Byzantium to Greece. There's a lot of variety there. We're told that the depictions of Cleopatra vary depending on who's depicting her, which is true to an extent, but I at least have not been able to find any descriptions of her being portrayed as African black remotely contemporary to her time. And finally, Dr. Issa tells us, the appeal of Cleopatra is that we imagine her, that everyone can imagine her in their own way. I imagine her to have curly hair like me, and a similar skin color. To which I say, no, and what a strange thing for a historian to say. The appeal of Cleopatra is that she's real. She's a real historical person with a remarkable story. A woman intelligent and powerful enough to contend with the power players of her day. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Augustus. She's inspiring to men and women, not because of how we can imagine her, but because of what we know she did, her cunning diplomacy, the way she ingratiated herself to the Egyptian people. Cleopatra is a fascinating woman to study because of reality, not self-insert fiction. Is it really a big deal what shade her skin color was? Well, apparently it is, because the show, which very strangely insists on depicting itself as wholly a docudrama, stops to spend a minute and a half here talking about what her race could be, because no historian at the time ever specifically said, well, she absolutely 100% is not black. And because the show does this, and because of all the little corrections we've already made this far, one has to start to wonder, does the show really want to tell the story of Cleopatra? Or does the show want to remake Cleopatra in a new image to tell a modern tale the showmakers want? And again, we're not considering anything the showmakers said in interviews or on social media to begin to wonder these things. We're wondering just from the show itself. We're 15 minutes into this 46-minute episode, so feel free to stand up and stretch. But the good news is we don't talk about things we don't know about race again, and for the most part, the rest of the episode does stick to things that we do know, like the challenges Cleopatra faced at the start of her reign, namely her family and Egypt's relationship with the Roman Republic. At the moment, Rome is embroiled in a civil war, which Professor Shelley quickly points out. Once again, it's about power. It's two men, as if to say, obviously, those men. It's popular among the common people, and conqueror of Gaul, Julius Caesar versus successful lifelong military commander and one-time son-in-law of Caesar's, Pompey the Great, who is backed by the noble and conservative upper classes. The show doesn't go into it much, and fair enough, it's not a documentary on Roman history. But the two men had previously been in an informal agreement of power sharing, which gradually fell apart into open combat. Now, to complicate things, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy, the old dead one, owed a lot of money to Rome, mainly to Pompey the Great, which means now she does. Pompey had been one of the biggest supporters of Ptolemy back when he, and presumably Cleopatra herself, had been exiled from the country and lived in Rome under Pompey's protection. Without his support, Ptolemy would not have been able to reclaim Egypt as king. Now, however, Pompey is losing his war against Caesar. Cleopatra is shown wanting to send Pompey support, or at least find out what he needs, out of fidelity to the man who had helped her father. Unfortunately, timid little brother Ptolemy is under the manipulative influence of the scheming, lighter-skinned eunuch, Pothinus. He doesn't want to be involved in a Roman war. She confronts them, or really Pothinus, because timid little brother isn't relevant. Cleopatra is troublesome to Pothinus, so his faction stages a palace coup, forcing Cleopatra and her sister to flee to southern Egypt, and then northeast to Syria, where over the next 2 years, she's able to raise an army. We get a neat montage of Cleopatra doing combat training, even besting her trainer. There is no historical evidence to support her doing any kind of combat training, but the show wants us to know she's as strong and capable as any man, even a larger and presumably better trained one. As the show has correctly shown already, she's a diplomatic-minded figure, bookish, not brawny, but we need her to be good at everything, so whatever. At this point, the pivotal Roman Civil War battle of Pharsalus happens, drastically turning the war in Caesar's favor. Pompey the Great flees to Egypt, hoping that because of his ties to the Ptolemies, he could try to rest and replenish what's left of his armies. Cleopatra sees this as an opportunity to try to regain her throne, so she returns as well. We then get a scene in which Cleopatra makes war plans with her generals, which again is cool, but there's no evidence that Cleopatra was directly involved in or ever had really studied military strategy. Again, as the show has shown, she's a diplomat, an administration-minded figure, not a military leader. But we need her to be good at everything, so whatever. In this scene, we also get an imagined conversation between Arsinoe and Cleopatra. Arsinoe suggests killing Pompey to demonstrate loyalty to Caesar, which Cleopatra rejects. We're not killing Caesar's son-in-law. It's at this point I can't help but notice the show is starting to have a pattern of assuming Cleopatra's motives are always good, pure, positive. This is purely a matter of speculation. Again, history records what Cleopatra did in many situations, but not her thought process in those moments. Again, it's dramatized, so there's room for artistic interpretation, of course. But all we see is her doing the right thing for the right reasons. Anyway, Pompey arrives in Egypt and gets stabbed, and he dies. We're told it's by Pothinus' machinations, because weak little brother's irrelevant, although it is worth noting that there are conflicting accounts as to whether or not it was Pothinus or the skillful rhetorician Theodotus who actually made the plan. Ptolemy's faction has the head of Pompey embalmed and sent to Caesar as a token of friendship. A mistake, as it turns out. Caesar is disgusted. Historically, this seems pretty accurate. He at least feigned being outraged. Caesar moves into the palace at Alexandria. The show leaves out that he called on Ptolemy and Cleopatra to reconcile and disband their armies. And then we have Cleopatra being snuck into the palace. With a slight tone of contempt, Professor Shelley tells us that the story of Cleopatra being snuck into the palace in a carpet comes from the historian Plutarch, true, who lived 150 years later, so he doesn't know. That is an interesting claim to make, since he's also the source of several other things the show chooses to present as fact, but okay. The meeting between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar is a significant event, with many versions and theories about what exactly it was that charmed the Roman leader. Was it her beauty, wit, charisma, cunning, or the potential for a valuable alliance that so enticed him? The show would have you think it's literally all of the above. We hear she's this really confident woman with lots of charisma, not bowing down to him, but shifting the power dynamic. She's a young, strong woman, intelligent, and an African woman who sees herself not only as a ruler, but as a goddess as well. So she'd be very different from the women Caesar would have been used to in Rome. Now that last bit is most certainly valid. Rome's powerful women used subtle, behind-the-scenes influence, and were not public political figures. It's interesting that the show chooses to call her an African woman. It's technically accurate. She's born and raised, mostly, in Africa. Kind of like how it's technically accurate for me to say that I'm a Native American, in that I was born in America. Then we get some scenes of the romance developing between the two of them, Cleopatra flexing her knowledges of languages, a moment of her giving clear consent to some intimacy to come, blah blah blah, moving on. So, a little more background context that the show doesn't give you. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy, made Rome the executor of his will. As such, 2 copies of his will were made. One kept in Egypt and followed shortly after his death, and one sent to the Senate in Rome. Now back to the show. We see Julius, now enamored with Cleopatra, announcing to the Alexandrian assembly that the time for peace has come, and publicly declaring that the will of Ptolemy, this Ptolemy, not this Ptolemy, will be followed. He also gives Arsinoe and Ptolemy, this Ptolemy, not this Ptolemy, the island of Cyprus, and to top it all off, he lowers the debt Egypt owes Rome. This is all true and good stuff. Then Arsinoe whispers some seeds of doubt into Cuck Ptolemy's ear. He tries to get the people to ride against Caesar and Rome, which doesn't work. He just gets laughed at by Caesar, and he storms off angrily with Arsinoe dignifiedly acknowledging Caesar before going off to join her brother in the brewing civil war. An aside, whiny Ptolemy really did try to get the people of Alexandria to riot, but that happened back when he first learned Cleopatra was in the palace with Caesar, not after the assembly, and at that time, Julius successfully had Ptolemy arrested and calmed down the crowd with his public speaking skills. So the civil war between Ptolemy and Cleopatra continues. We see more riots, the Library of Alexandria burns because of sibling rivalry. One of the experts, with a haircut I can't stand, says that Arsinoe has marshaled her own forces during the conflict as well. We witness a scene in which one of Cleopatra's servants says that Arsinoe has taken control of the Egyptian army and had the leader executed and declared herself ruler. And that's true. Arsinoe did have the leader of Ptolemy's forces killed and replaced with one of her men, and she was declared queen by her troops. Then we learn Cleopatra is pregnant with the child of Julius Caesar, a child of Egypt and Rome, with the potential to unite both. This child is significant enough that Augustus would, allegedly, but probably, later have him killed at the age of 17, to preclude another heir of Caesar that could oppose him. Augustus's initial support came from the loyalty the legions and people had towards Julius. Being the heir to Caesar was the springboard that launched his career. However, it's worth noting that Julius explicitly named Augustus, known as Octavian at the time, as his heir, and he never acknowledged Cleopatra's child as his own. It's unlikely that Rome would have embraced the son of a foreign queen as Julius's heir. Back to the war, which saw Caesar and Cleopatra besieged in the palace of Alexandria, it continues until Caesar's reinforcements arrive, and the Egyptians get absolutely destroyed. Arsinoe is captured, and whiny Ptolemy, dressed in golden armor, somehow falls off a ship into the Nile, and he dies. Cleopatra wins. Then we get an imagined encounter between Cleopatra and Arsinoe, where Cleopatra is shown to be gentle, caring, and earnestly trying to understand why her sister would betray her, which 100% romanticizes her motives again. This woman tried to get Caesar to have Arsinoe executed, and later succeeded in getting Mark Antony to have Arsinoe executed. No evidence supports this genuine moment of earnest concern and feeling betrayed. They were a ruthless family, and familicide was commonplace. Cleopatra marries her next younger brother, Ptolemy. It's a little bit easier now, he's the last one standing. However, she has all the power, since he's still a kid, and she more or less has purged the court of the factions that opposed her. She's 7 months pregnant with Caesar's child, and it's at this point, having established peace, Julius leaves Egypt for Rome. He takes Arsinoe with him, presumably to parade her through the streets in his triumph celebration, which customarily features parading the prominent captured foes before strangling them to death at the end. And the episode ends on the cliffhanger that Julius doesn't have Arsinoe killed. That's episode 1, and before we go into some closing analysis, consider helping me build this fledgling channel by giving me a like or subscribing. One of you will literally be my first sub. Moving on, having now described this episode in full, hopefully providing you with some helpful historical context along the way, here are my final thoughts. Regarding the drama side, Adele James acts well. She doesn't look like Cleopatra, but her performance is the best part of the drama. She's convincingly confident, lively, and appropriately emotive. John Partridge also does well, giving Caesar a cool, powerful aura that makes you feel like the man is in control and not to be underestimated. The rest of the cast and acting gets a meh for me, fine at best, rather stiff much the rest of the time. Sets are fine, nothing really extraordinary. Regarding the docu side, you'll remember that a while back I asked, does the show really want to tell the story of Cleopatra, or does the show want to remake Cleopatra in a new image to tell a modern tale the showmakers want? To answer that, let's look at the things the show seems to care about. 1. Her gender. That's what the opening teaser wanted to focus on. Women ruling with unparalleled power, unapologetic, bowing to no man, leaving footprints so deep no man could erase them. 2. Her skin color. That's the first thing mentioned when the show actually starts, mentioned before even giving us the year or Cleopatra's age. Then they bring it up later and spend the better part of 2 minutes stressing what we don't know but could maybe be true and they like to imagine. I would think a documentary would be trying to teach people what we know, not teaching what we can imagine. 3. Being a powerful woman, which here means depicting her as being good at everything, even things we have no evidence she did, like combat and military strategy. 4. Romanticizing her personality, giving her consistently noble, if not nearly selfless, motives. She's never afraid, she's confident. All those types of things. 5. Telling us actual facts about her life, which is in there, but it doesn't feel like the main point. A notable missing example is her childhood. They leave that out almost entirely. True, we don't know a lot of specifics about her childhood, but the show isn't afraid to make some leaps and assumptions elsewhere. That suggests to me they don't want to talk about her life before the death of her father because they don't want to show her living in the shadow of anyone else, especially a man. Looking at all that, I'd say the show wants to remake Cleopatra in a new image to tell a modern story that the showmakers like. And that's not what I want out of a docuseries. So is it worth giving it a watch? I say no. I recommend passing on this one. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you've watched the show or plan to, as well as anything I said that you agree or disagree with. Thank you for viewing, and I'll see you next time.